Hello, this is our Good Passwords workshop. It is part of a three-part series as part of our digital literacy curriculum. The first is Good Passwords, the second is multi-factor authentication, and the third is secure browsing. If you're interested in those other topics, please listen for additional information at the end of the presentation. Your presenters will begin by introducing themselves.
Jonathan.
I'm Jonathan Bradley. I'm the head of studios and innovative technologies here in the University Libraries.
And I'm Kayla McNabb. I'm head of instructional content and design for the University Libraries. And the two of us are teaching all three parts of this series together. So to kind of set the scene, we have a bit of a quote about passwords. So what's important is no longer either a signature or a number, but a code, and the code is your password. So historically, your signature was something that carried a lot of weight. It was how you would agree to things. It was how you would access important information. But more and more in the digital age, your password is becoming the code, the key to be able to access things that are important. Mm-hmm. So you want to make sure they're good.
Yep.
And that's what we're going to cover. So this is a bit of a rundown of the things that we're going to go over today. Each part in the series, the first thing that we start with thinking about is assessing your needs. So everyone who takes this class is going to be in a different place on that scale. Different places that you access will be on different places on the scale. Data breaches, we'll get into that a little bit and kind of the impetus for good passwords. We'll talk about different aspects of passwords, passphrases, and then get to password managers and how you might be able to employ something like that to improve your overall use of good passwords. And then we'll touch on security questions as something related to the login process that it would be productive for us to think about. And then next steps. So after you go through the content that we're going to share with you today, where do you go from here? How do you do something with this? How do you operationalize this? These slides are available at this bit.ly, and that bit.ly code will be in the upper corner throughout all of the slides. So if you want to access these slides later, that is consistently where they are located. So, yep, y'all can see up here. So in the upper corner. Next, there we go. So different information requires different levels of security. So what we're going to present to you is a sliding scale for you to consider. So some things you may feel are less important information. So your online recipes at your allrecipes.com account or your Food Network account may not have a lot of information about you. Maybe your name, maybe your email address, and that you really like taco soup. But not a lot of information that you're really worried about getting out there. And then kind of the other end of this scale is, say you're responsible for something that could be considered a government secret or some sort of proprietary information that it would be really dangerous or particularly costly if it was accessed. So all of the things, all the accounts that you log into fall somewhere on this sort of continuum. And where they fall and how important they are to you is going to dictate what kind of security you want to implement. So why do we care about this?
Because of data breaches. So data breach is happens when access to a data store, usually owned by a company, is leaked in some way. Usually a hacker breaks into the system, pulls all the data records, and then posts them somewhere, often on the dark web, usually selling them at some sort of cost. They have been happening a lot lately, as you can see, and it's not just from small companies. It's from major players with a lot of data to lose, including banks, social media networks, everything. So what's the big deal about these data breaches and why is this a problem? So what happens for a lot of hackers is they will take the credentials that come out of a data breach and they will use those to access another site. So they will go through the list, they'll take email addresses, and they'll go try those email addresses and the passwords that come out of these data breaches onto popular sites. So they get your Facebook password, they go to your Amazon account, your AWS, they try your email address and your password there. So if you're using the same password, then they just got access to your system. So when these data breaches happen, there's sort of levels to how hard and whether or not the company was doing what they were supposed to be doing. So there's company negligence, and if people are storing passwords in plain text in a database, this is a great example of company negligence. If someone ever sends you your password, your actual password, you should be wary. That means they have stored it in plain text in some fashion, and that is bad. That is an immediate, as soon as this data breach happens, immediately a hacker can try all of these accounts on all of these different websites with no work on their part. And preferably, passwords go in databases either hashed and salted, or hashed and salted and peppered, which is on this scale. I won't go into too much detail about what all that means, but the summary is sort of mixing extra pieces of information in here and storing it as a random series of numbers and letters that can be used to compare the password you put in to what is on the inside of the database to see if those two things match and you have authentication.
So you're talking about data breaches, and while you're talking about that, I wanted to ask, I think like Experian or one of the credit report companies got hacked.
Yes.
And I tell you every year to go to those companies and get your credit report. And that year I didn't. And I did for a couple of years. And I think I finally just went back to that. But I mean, my guess is it got hacked, and within days, hopefully it was fixed and not a problem. But I don't know how you feel about if it's safe now to go back to these.
Well, so the really frustrating part of the three credit reporting unions is you don't volunteer your data to them. They get it from the US government.
Yeah.
So like whether you go there or not, they have that data. When it's breached, it's lost. I mean, I don't trust them. It was not that long after that hack. It was a couple months later that someone discovered they had an admin portal that was using a default login. I mean, it's a lot of incompetence. Ultimately, for a long time, people weren't, they were worried about passwords and stuff, but the amount of data and the realization that what it could be used for and how it could be leveraged in situations wasn't really well understood. So a lot of people were growing sort of lax on their security. And there were a lot of homegrown systems, and a lot of that is starting to change, and people are realizing that it's much better to rely on like an open source central authentication program in which security expert. CAS can be shibboleth. So what it ultimately comes down to is like, I mean, you can also do these sorts of authentication and incorporate them into applications. And the goal is that there's a team of sort of unaffiliated security experts who are consistently pointing out this is a flaw, this is a flaw, and this is a flaw, and people are developing solutions to those versus a small team who has a lot of other responsibilities being required to, in addition to do all the other stuff of their job, also keep up to date with every new security vulnerability that happens on the internet and updating their authentication program to cover those holes. Instead, there's sort of a community that are working on it for a central goal of everybody having secure authentication, not just a single company. So people have started moving away from like rolling their own authentication, which helps, but there's still a lot of legacy systems. There was a survey a while back of a lot of these major banks that have been players with the US government for decades now, still have code that was written in assembly, and they can't find anybody to maintain their code bases and stuff like that. So how much do I trust them? No, not a whole lot. There are other ways to get your credit reports that don't involve going directly through them. And you can pursue one of those, but in the end, as for like engaging with them, it doesn't really matter if you engage with them because they get your information whether you voluntarily gave it to them or not.
I run the battle with DirecTV. They're like, go online. I'm like, I don't want my information online.
And a big part of kind of the purpose of the workshop is to think through different ways that you can limit that possible access and that you can protect yourself in the instances where you do need to have some information stored in a way that you don't necessarily have full control over. So yeah, so we'll definitely get into that more as well. So kind of wrapping up data breaches. Have you been part of a data breach? Yes,
Spoiler is
the spoiler there.
almost 100%. Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know,
Yeah, so this site,
So-
she's going to bring it up here. This site scans all the information that gets posted from data breaches online. If you put an email address in there, Kayla's putting in,
So this
One-
is my undergraduate school email address.
and it will search for your email address in those data breaches. It'll tell you what websites were involved in the data breaches and what information was lost.
Yeah, so you can see here email address, IP addresses, passwords, and usernames, and then email addresses and passwords. So you know if you've been using, like if I was still using the same password that I was using for MyFitnessPal in 2018 on anything else, then I would need to change that immediately based on this information. So it's definitely useful to check back here periodically, and all it's doing is checking your email address against the list that came out with these data breaches.
Yeah. You can also, if you care, you can set it up to notify you when new data
Yeah.
breaches happen that involve your email address. I have that set up on my email account, and I get an email probably twice a year from some site that's been data breached, and I look what's been taken, I figure out if any action is required on my part, and so it's a nice service.
You recommend going, entering all your old username and passwords?
Well, you don't want to you don't put any passwords in
Yeah,
there.
you
It's
just put the
Or your
email
old
addresses.
email address.
yeah.
Yep. I would run through the
Anyone
ones that
that's
you-
still active, like if it's one that you're still using,
Well, it can also be a good way to identify accounts that you need to close.
That is
If-
true, if you
If
put
it's
in-
associated with an email address that you still have access to, but you don't really use much anymore, like my MTSU email address, it's a good way to see, well, these are other places that I still have an account that maybe if I don't use, I should just close to limit it as a risk.
Yeah. Okay. For instance, I have an ET account, I got my bachelor's from Radford, and I attended New River.
Mhm.
I haven't been to New River in years, but actually, if I went to, the account's still there, and I don't even know how I would ask him. And then I did community college in 100 places when I was
Yeah.
younger.
most universities, there's a form on their page for shutting down your account.
Yeah.
Depending on the college, so most colleges and universities will shut down an account if you didn't get a degree or finish a degree there, and
Right.
then some shut down the account. It depends from university to college after a certain number of years of being away from the school. So
Or
like-
inactivity.
or
on the account.
inactivity, like if you're not using it. So depending on the school, you may or may not still have those accounts open, and so you can check and see. If it's a major undergraduate university like Radford, like I know my Radford account from where I got my master's degree is still active, and I finished my degree there and there. So a lot of places like that leave them open because they want to use those email addresses for outreach for alumni, but some other schools, if it's just taxing on the server, so they'll just turn it off. Email addresses aren't being used.
So New River probably shut it down, but Radford's gonna keep it forever.
Radford will probably keep it unless you ask them to shut it down. New River may or may not.
Yeah. If you completed a degree there, then
they may
possibly.
have left it on. If you
Yeah.
didn't, then they probably turned it off.
I just took some cheapo classes there that
Yeah.
Yeah, they
Then
probably should.
probably within a semester of you being a non-active student anymore, it stopped working. Yeah.
you know, if Radford got too bad for just last year.
I think so.
So, yeah. So kind of thinking about that, what can you do? Obviously, it's preferable if you use trustworthy sites. That'd be great. But sometimes we're not able to do that, right? Like
I mean, Capital
Facebook,
One.
Capital One, DoorDash, if you're going to use those services, you don't really have a lot of option, right? But as best you can, putting your information only on trustworthy sites. Improving your passwords, that's what we're going to focus on by and large today, and thinking about some different strategies to do that. First step in that is having unique passwords. So if you're using the same password for every place that you have an account, that's the first thing to go in and change. You want to have different passwords for every site. And the easiest way to do this is to use a password manager that we'll talk about. But you don't want to have mutations on one password. So some examples here would be like Fluffy1, exclamation point. I know I worked at a bank, and in the banking industry, they require changes in passwords very frequently. For us, I think it was every 6 weeks. So there would be a lot of people, bless you, who just use a variation on the password they were using before, because otherwise, how are you going to remember it for the next 6 weeks and then you have to change it again? But that is very poor security. Another type of mutation that people often use is including the name of the site in the password. And you really want to avoid that, because in a list of Amazon passwords, the word Amazon is going to be something that comes up again and again. And it's going to be the sort of thing that if someone were looking at a set of that data, they may be able to identify.
Well, I mean, the bigger problem with mutations is that human beings are predictable.
Yes.
And, you know, for mutations like this, there have been a number of studies lately that show cracking a password that has mutations versus like a password that they have access to. So if they know your password is fluffy with an exclamation point, to get to fluffy Amazon or Google or exclamation, like any of these other mutations that people commonly do, it adds a magnitude of like 15 to 30 seconds worth of work for hackers.
I mean, I know even the beauty of Gmail is you can access it anywhere, but if I logged in from something here, I would get an email saying somebody just.
Yes, and that is a great addition to security, because it helps as long as you still have access and you're still in control of that account. That's really the biggest risk, is if someone's able to get access to your email account and then is able to circumvent the security systems that are in place.
And not all websites have that feature. Right. A lot of ones that are high target, high valuable, like Gmail, AWS accounts, any of the like cloud providers for networking and stuff like that.
I mean, even things like Twitter now.
Yeah, I mean, those sorts of sites that are targeted often, they'll try to implement that, where changes to an account from an unrecognized IP address or region or computer are temporary until a certain time period. Usually it's a couple days. They're sort of logged, and there's an opportunity for somebody to come in and say, no, that wasn't me, which is convenient. But if you're off traveling, you may miss it. If you're just offline, or it's an account that you aren't necessarily paying that much attention to, these sorts of things can pop up. Yeah.
So the thing to think about with this, if you're going to change your password so that you have unique passwords, then you want to make sure that those passwords are strong. So a longer password is a stronger password, period. It's harder. It's going to take longer for someone to crack if it's longer. So a minimum of 12 characters, if that's allowable by the place that you're making the account, is great. You should shoot for as long as is allowed. So some accounts say no more than 16 characters, and some say 35 or 40.
And some say, whatever, forever.
And so if it's one of those high value accounts, you definitely want to go as long as possible. So check something like your passwords, not your actual password, on a service like howsecureismypassword.net. So I'm going to show a couple of examples here. So I've got, how secure it.
They spelled it all out. Right?
Yep, all of it's spelled out. So a few examples. So MulePass, all lowercase, MulePass, would take 5 seconds. At the current level of technology, to crack would take 5 seconds. If I go back through and just capitalize the first of each word, it goes from 5 seconds to 22 minutes. If I go through and make it longer, so instead of MulePass, I'm going to go Mule Password Protect, and I'm going to change out some of the letters for numbers and symbols. So I'm going to type MUL3 instead of E, capital P, @ instead of A, 2 S's, WOR, D, PR, 0 instead of O, TECT. So now it's at 552 quadrillion years. So this isn't a particularly long password. It's pretty long, but it's kind of a phrase. So you want to choose something that's a phrase, ideally, that's going to be easy for you to remember. But
one convenient tip is like song lyrics. People like songs that people enjoy, they'll cut out a piece of the lyrics, use that phrase as their password when they set up a password for a site. And it also lends you if you have one song that you love, you could just pick different lyric sets from that song for various sites.
Yeah.
And you know what, always know what it is.
And so,
One
yeah.
thing that's important to keep in mind with these, though, this is with the current technology.
Right.
So this is what it would take today to brute force one of these passwords. And in those situations, length is far more of a factor mathematically than the actual complexity of password. Being more complex is valuable, but length is what grows exponentially as you add each additional potential character, because brute forcing the password means the hacker has to go through every possible index that character could be, which for Unicode I think is 92 options. So every additional character raises the amount of time exponentially by like 92. So that's why length ends up being more important than complexity, although complexity can help. But that is with current technology. Google recently announced that they had achieved quantum supremacy, which means that they were able to do something with a quantum computer that they measured at 200 seconds, and I think it was measured to be 10,000 years on a normal computer. So those numbers, even though they seem high at 10 billion years,
yeah,
ultimately are drastically reduced when some of this new technology that's on the horizon becomes available.
Right.
And there have been multiple instances of proof that hacker groups, particularly those that have been state-sponsored, so China, Russia, countries like this that are regularly partaking in digital espionage, have access, because they're state-sponsored, to quantum computing technology and can utilize it for these sorts of attacks. That being said, it's better to err on the side of those longer, higher numbers than it is on these lesser ones. And somewhere down the road, we're eventually going to get to the point where passwords are no longer a viable method of authentication. Huh? Yeah, I mean, yeah, there's a lot of options. We talk about that in two-factor as like better ways of getting into sites.
Yeah.
But there's only so much you can do with a password before the computing power overpasses how long it takes to just decrypt one of these things.
Yeah.
break
And
one
so
of them.
there's a link to an article about this from The Verge in the slides, if you want to follow that and read more about this in particular.
You like The Verge?
Huh?
You like The Verge?
It depends on what the news is. It's this is something that has been triangulated across multiple platforms, and the information that's in this article is easily digestible.
Yeah, they link out to the Google's official announcement page.
Yeah.
And also IBM's response.
Right. Yeah. IBM says that the world's most powerful computer currently would take 2.5 days to do what this did in 200 seconds. And Google's calculations are 10,000 years. But either way, it's better for your password to, with current technology, be listed at 552 quadrillion years to break.
I mean, mostly IBM is upset because they wanted to claim quantum supremacy. So they were trying to undermine Google's claim. Because it's good for their business model with Watson.
So moving from kind of general passwords into passphrases, we've touched on this a little bit. It helps with the length and complexity. So like Jonathan mentioned, things like song lyrics really can be good here. They're easier to remember because there's some sort of connection between the words in your mind. And so let's check a passphrase in our how secure is my password. So we go to that again. So all lowercase letters, I'm going to put the passphrase, I have a great guard dog. $607 million years. All lowercase letters. This is just a string of words that's a statement about how excellent my dog Nola is at telling us when people are here. You say, what is she? She is a Manchester Terrier.
What?
Manchester Terrier. She looks like a tiny Doberman Pinscher, and she is feisty. But I mean, not super long, all lowercase letters. Still, this is coming up with 607 million years. So better than just an 8-character password. So you could definitely take a lot of steps to improve this if you do things like replacing different aspects of the word. So say every time this letter comes up, I'm going to replace it with this number or symbol. Well, it's mostly for things like rainbow tables.
Yeah.
Right. Is why you would
So you don't
do
match
this.
in a rainbow table, a hacker's rainbow table. So if you replace letters, then the hash algorithm that comes out when a hacker takes a database, you won't match with anyone that has similar words, and the hash will be completely different.
Right. So for brute force, it doesn't change. But for comparing,
so like if
a
you're,
rainbow table,
and this is a terrible password, I don't recommend doing this. So like if your password was, if you were going to do the terrible cliched thing and have the word password be your password, but you, if you did an ampersand instead of A, when someone looks at a rainbow table and it comes out with all the hashed algorithms, they can immediately look at the hashes and say, all right, let's just run a quick look. These are probably all the ones that are the word password. You won't match with any of those that come out, because since you changed a character, your hash will look different than theirs. And so your hash ends up looking unique in the rainbow table, and they have to take the time to actually decrypt it.
Yeah. And with something like a rainbow table, you just want to be harder to hack than the people who are easy to hack.
I mean, and it's one of those things where it buys you extra time to change the password if you're aware that the breach happened.
Yeah.
So the people who had password as theirs and it immediately becomes apparent, and any of the top 10 passwords, most commonly used passwords.
Yeah. Like
I mean,
monkey, but
their
you use
their time from breach to like when infiltration can happen is literally seconds.
Yeah.
If you are not part of the common listing in the rainbow table and they actually have to decrypt it, it can buy you a day or two of time that you would have to sort of change your password once you know the breach has happened, before you'd have to worry about them actually infiltrating, unless for some reason they were targeting specifically you. But
right.
That.
And if that's the case, then that's a different set of concerns.
Yeah, if you unless you've got two-factor, which is the second lesson, then you're probably pretty doomed.
So, and really, these are more so ways for you to remember the passwords that you have to have that need to be great passwords. What we would suggest is, by and large, your passwords should be in a password manager, and they should be entirely randomly generated. So don't save, kind of an initial warning, don't save your passwords in your browser. It's not a password manager. It is more secure than it used to be, but it is still not secure.
I mean, there was an article not that long ago about Chrome was leaking passwords that was saved in within the browser. That's not what it's intended to do. It's a convenience thing, and they make a lot of assumptions about how you're going to use it, what you're going to do with it. But it is not a password manager. It has flaws.
Yeah. So with that in mind, how do password managers work? So they store your passwords securely on your device and the server. They are secured in transit. The exact method of the security varies a little bit, manager to manager, and we can get into some of that a little bit. And it's locked with a master password. So that master password is something that you want to make sure is an amazing password, because that is the one that you need to remember. And then you use an app or an extension to autofill and generate these passwords for different types of use. So on your in your browser, on your mobile devices, this is how you're going to actually operationalize it day to day.
Yeah. So like if you like the convenience of the browser-based password fills, I mean, the using password manager functions essentially for the convenience factor works the same, except it's more secure for the way you actually house the password. So it'll automatically fill them. You can also tell it, like, you know, if you can just tell it, this is the site I want to go to, take me there and log me into it all in one like fell swoop. and it'll go through, unless you've got two-factor authentication, and then it'll take you to the two-factor authentication page where you got to do whatever two-factor authentication thing you have to do. But it can be very convenient, and usually if you are invested and you put your passwords in there, it does make passwords much less of a concern and an issue for you, and they become sort of a second nature.
So, Gina text two-factor,
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
and that cookie based, and they have that little checkbox, remember me for 7 days?
Mm-hmm.
You don't have a problem with that, or is that a?
So if you're logging in on a device that only you have access to, then that's less of a concern.
Yeah, part of that question goes to physical security.
Yes.
Which is another factor that we only talk about briefly in, I think, the third section.
Yes.
But physical security of a device can often be as important as the digital security of it. If you aren't expecting anyone to ever be able to access this computer, if it requires a login after it goes to sleep after 10 minutes or something like that, it's in a locked room, all this stuff, those sort of options are safer and something that you can rely on. If you share a space in like a cubicled area, or you are taking convenience in other places by having your computer never lock or something like that.
Or if you work in an office where an administrative assistant has keys to your office.
Yeah.
Like
all of those can mean maybe relying on that is not as good.
Right.
So there is definitely a physical security factor to keep in mind when it comes to, it's a convenient thing. I understand why they turned it on. There's a lot of faculty members who have locked offices and they would rather not be asked every time they log in. And for them, it's probably perfectly fine. Then there are other people on campus who it's not necessarily a great idea to turn it on or to use it.
Yeah. Let's see, well, I'll touch on that in a second. So question of password managers that we get to often is, are they a security risk, right? I'm putting all my information in one place. Is that not risky as well? So far, they've had no major security breaches, and many of the companies, the ones that we're going to talk about, not all password companies, but the ones we're going to talk about have a lot of transparency in the way that they secure your data. And
so in a lot of the situations,
professionals
whatever
agree.
the sort of standard behavior that's recommended by security experts, they do that and they go well beyond that. Because for them, their business model is you trusting them. The moment you stop trusting them, they've lost their business model and they'll fail as a company. So a while back, there was a thing that was like LastPass has a security vulnerability. That was just the headline that went out. When you go in and you read the article, you find out the security vulnerability relied on physical, like losing physical security. So someone else had to have physical access to a computer you'd been on. They had to have it within 5 minutes of you logging into a site. The situation in which it was usable was extremely narrow. But despite all of that, LastPass had patched and pushed out the fix for the vulnerability before the article could be written and posted, and they had to do an amendment that was like they actually posted the patch for this earlier today, because they know that if you don't trust them, then their business is shot.
Right, and we get into some discussions about that in the secure browsing, the third part of the series as well. If you're not paying for a service, then you are paying for a service, right? Somehow you're paying for it. So thinking about cost versus convenience is something that's really important to think about with password managers. So some of the password managers you can use in a limited capacity for free. And really the benefit of that for them is that you realize that they're convenient and that you want the additional conveniences of the paid versions. So we've got a few options to kind of, there we go. So paid versions of some of the password managers that we're going to talk about today range from $20 per year to a little over $100 per year. It depends on how you want to be able to use them. So the limitation is having access to the app is really the big benefit that you're going to get from having the paid version versus the free version. You can only use the free version in a browser. Or if you want to pay for a family account, so you and everyone in your immediate family could essentially be putting your passwords into a central place, so that if something happened to you or something happened to someone you care about, you'd be able to, after a period of time, access their passwords to handle things for them. Or they could share things directly with you in a way that's easier. So there are some of those different levels of convenience that are afforded by the paid versions that are not afforded by the free versions. But these companies really want to offer you that free version so you can say, hey, this is something that's really helpful for me day to day to use in my browser. I want to be able to use it on my phone. I want to be able to share passwords with people in a secure way. So kind of some things to think about with that. And comparing password managers, we also want you to think about things that aren't passwords that you can store in them. So part of that, that benefit is that they want you to see this as a place to secure lots of different things and share these things in a secure fashion. So different types of banking information, credit card numbers, identifying information, social security number, driver's license, passport. You could save that sort of information in something like your LastPass, and then be able to pull that up anywhere without having your social security card. You should know your social security number, but you probably don't know your passport number right off. So having that in a place that's easy to access. Things like insurance cards that you may not carry with you all the time, or if you have a spouse or a child that you don't necessarily give a card to, but they need that information, then that's the sort of thing that can also be shared in a password manager in a secure way. So software licenses and developer secrets can also be shared and stored in these ways.
Here within the library, we share a lot of API keys and things like that via LastPass. So email and Hangouts and all these are not secure means of transit.
Right. Yeah. So kind of a different way to think about the sort of thing that you could store in a password manager. So some potential password managers that to this point have been fairly secure, and we would definitely be interested in talking about these more if you'd like. So LastPass is one that the university has an account with that you can use through the university. If you have a personal LastPass, there is a way to, I think individual departments sign on for contracts with them. I know the library has a contract. If you have a personal LastPass, you can link those in such a way that the university administrators would not be able to see your personal passwords, but you can access them through the same login, which can be convenient for that separation. KeePass is the last one. So, and these, like I said, they vary in price, and they also vary in application a little bit. So KeePass is open source.
Yep.
And is self-hosted.
So you figure out, like, do you want to keep this in a Google Drive, somewhere else? How do you want to store this? Do you keep it on a thumb drive? Like, where do you store your password lock file, essentially? And you have a lot of different options for that. But they make it an open source process for you to sort of do that. If you just don't want to trust a company, or you don't want to pay for it from another company, you can sort of roll your own.
So a lot of different options for working within that. I have the most experience with LastPass, though I have tried KeePass in the past and it works well. The conveniences of LastPass are just substantial. Yeah, it's just so easy to use. So not an advertisement for LastPass. It's just what I use. So almost done with some of the content, and then we can dive into questions.
So security questions, they're not passwords, but they're related to passwords because you get asked them a lot. And quite honestly, they're terrible security. I don't know why we still do this. I wish more companies would get on board with getting away from this. Mm-hmm. Don't answer them truthfully. A lot of the questions they ask are a matter of public record. Your mother's maiden name is not a thing someone has to get from you. They can go down to a courthouse. They don't even have to go there. They can just go to the courthouse's website and find out your mother's maiden name.
And
They
some
can-
things that aren't a matter of public record are also just easily accessible,
Right.
given social media and.
And even if you aren't posting things, like I don't generally participate in social media, but my family does. They post things about me. So like, even if you're not necessarily on it, other people may be posting things. So there's this whole matter of like all these questions that you're being asked and are being treated like a level of security that are not a level of security. So we have a tendency to recommend that you just treat them like a secondary password field. If you have a password manager, you can even put in whatever you type in there. The password manager just randomly generate some stuff and throw it in. That's what I usually do if they force me to do security questions. But you can also think of them as like, here's some other passwords, but you don't want someone who's trying to get access to your account to get to your security questions, see the question, you know, what was your dog's name or something, and then they go just Google you, find a friend's Facebook account where they posted a picture of your dog and tagged it or something, and then they just go, all right, well, let's type that in. That's how I get in. Sort of thing. These can be a big hole in the security that you're building for your accounts and your online identity.
Yeah. Ideally, you would still get an email that someone is trying to access your account from a new place, but that really depends on the account.
And it depends on the site. So if you go through security questions, often the email you get is a confirmation that your password was changed, not necessarily this was logged in from a different computer sort of thing. So the way people get into your access your account can vary as well with the sorts of like messages that you get.
Right. And sometimes the system is set up to allow you to change the password right there in the browser after you answer the security questions.
Yeah.
So if that's the case, then someone who's able to get that information is very easily able to lock you out of your own account.
There was a lot of really bad practices that were put in place years ago, and we're still suffering from some of them. But
yeah, so that's a quick rundown of some of these strategies. Happy to answer questions about any of these things, about other things that you may have questions about, and questions about the things that are included in the other sessions if you are kind of interested in what is offered there.
I thought I'd let somebody else go first.
I don't know, Jordan, are there any questions in the chat? No? All right.
All right.
An attendee said that they use KeePass, which is another password manager, and then asked if password managers can see your passwords or if those are secured.
So the company LastPass does not have access to anything that you put in there.
Right.
They can't even resetting your master password is actually, there's like more steps than you would expect because of the way that it is encrypted and it's handled, and you can read about how they do it.
Yeah,
but like
links in the
they can't even they can barely help you with recovering it because they purposely made it a system that is secured from them as well as anyone else. And this has been verified by multiple subpoena requests from the US government, and LastPass has responded to every single one of them with, we cannot help you in any way, shape, or form access this information. We have no means of doing so. So they, I mean, they've got that. That's usually in the world of security, sort of your, is sort of the marker of like verified like security. And we talk about that a little bit with VPNs, is if you get a subpoena from the US government and you respond
there's no way
legally that there's no way for me to grant this to you, then most people in the security industry say they're actually doing what they're supposed to, or they say they're doing, which not everybody does. A lot of people say, oh, we don't have access to your stuff. And then when the subpoena comes in, they're like, oh, we found a way to get it. And the truth is they weren't doing what they were saying they were doing. But LastPass has gone through multiple subpoenas and responded to all of them the same way. What they can do is whoever's in your department who's administering your account generally will have access to the passwords that you put into the enterprise work version of it.
Yes.
And this is considered not like a vulnerability or something. It's considered the feature, because the idea is that you're using like these are the people who you're sharing passwords with. So like we have an IT here in the university libraries, and our systems administrator has access to many of the passwords that I put in there, specifically if I put them in the enterprise one, because they're passwords for our servers and stuff. They're the things that he needs access to. They're the things I need access to.
And if something
And
happened to you,
if I got
then
hit by a
the
car,
benefit
then
of it
he
is that
still
you're-
has
yeah.
access to that server, and it's not locked out because I had a randomly generated password and he didn't know what it was, and he no longer has access to it.
Right. But an individual LastPass account, there is not anybody who can
But
access that.
that's
and
also
reset that
set up
for you.
with that, and that is also set up with like folders that are designated.
Yes.
So like I have a folder from the systems administrator that I know whatever I put in that folder will be shared with them.
Yes.
I can still make other things even in the enterprise account that aren't shared with him. So so like my VT like PID and password are in my enterprise LastPass, but they're not shared with him. So he can't like log into my PID and password. He didn't get access to those passwords. So it's a good way to just think of them as like folders. And
Yeah.
some of them are shared, and you can choose to share these with the people who should have access to them so that they can. And then you can also have other folders that are just for you and that nobody else has access to.
I think.
Yeah, LastPass in particular they post a lot of their white papers online.
Yes.
They're very transparent about how they operate. And so if you have questions about the technical implementation of anything about their business, they probably release that information, including the encryption algorithms they use and stuff, because they want verification that
External
they're
verification.
they're going above and beyond sort of the Call of Duty. And currently, if you ask cybersecurity experts, using a password manager is the #1 thing at the top of their list that they recommend. And they have for the last, I think, 4 years. It's been the top recommendation comes out from their annual conference that they do every year.
You said security experts. I've noted it twice. Who do you call security experts? SANS? Who are you calling a security expert?
Oh, it's just people in the field who write white papers, who produce this sort of software, and who have been. I mean, it's the same sort of question of like, how do you get qualified as expertise? Usually, you've studied and you've produced research, and you are recognized by other people who are working in that industry as an expert. And so there's a conference that comes out every year where people who do publications, who do research, who develop software for these sorts of things, they come, they do presentations, they talk, and they get polled every year about sort of what is your recommendations to the populace about what should people be doing to improve their cybersecurity. And that's where a lot of these recommendations are coming out of here. So it's not necessarily one individual. It's sort of the mass collective of people across the world who are doing this sort of work about, well, what algorithms are more secure? What should the best practices be for any given sort of thing? Asking those sorts of questions, doing research, and producing software to improve those sorts of security.
And these are the highest impact, lowest work kind of suggestions, right? So password managers and physical second factor. Being the kind of what they're suggesting for folks.
Yeah.
So
I can tell you that we get interns where I work, and when they come to where I work and want to work, I say, first thing I say is, you're going to get a lot of passwords. You should have a password manager, and every one of them to a person doesn't do it.
We
I forgot to update our dates. I need to get our new dates on there.
my VT LastPass, I think last time I checked it is about 250 passwords or so in it. It's a lot.
I have a lot of passwords. So these are the kind of key things to think about with implementing these things. So changing your passwords for each account, having a different password for each account. So making your passwords more complicated or using passphrases, particularly for a master password. If you're going to use a password manager, researching the different password managers to see if some and other questions to remove any publicly available information at the very least. So, considering other strategies for answering those questions, and it's going to be harder for people to find. And then attending our other 2 workshops. So like I said, multi-factor is in March, and then secure browsing is in April. And those are at calendar.lib.vt.edu is where you can sign up for those.
Calendar used to be all FDI, and then there's been a number of iterations where they had these kind of classes.
So this is just through through the library, but we are often cross-listed with the Professional Development Network through TLOS as well. But that's just the list within the library. So here are some resources, some links that you can refer back to. So the password checkers that we talked about, LastPass has one. Jonathan looked at the How Secure Is My Password. As far as we can tell, it doesn't appear that they are sending that password anywhere. If you put in your actual password, it doesn't appear that it's going anywhere.
But also
We would
just-
suggest
just
that
don't
you
do that.
use a password that is similar in length and complexity to your password, not your actual password.
It's important for length and complexity. You know, if you're close, it's good. But yeah, in general, don't ever put a password that you're using
Anywhere
on,
other
on
than-
another site.
Yeah. And then this link to YouTube is a computer file video about how password managers encrypt things. So if you want to get a little bit more into the technical side of things, I think that's a really accessible way of explaining a fairly complex topic. So there's that. And then Credit Karma is one. There are many different comparisons of password managers. This one seemed pretty fairly balanced. But which is the best password manager, which is the most suggested changes periodically, right? So,
And which one's the best for you?
and which is the
given
best
your
for you is
needs.
going to vary. So this is just one place to learn a little bit more about them side by side, but there are a lot of resources to be able to do that as well. So we're over time, but thank you for coming.